Sarah had always considered herself the kind of person who saw the best in everyone. She had a warm heart, a loving husband named David, and a comfortable life she had worked hard to build. Yet, no matter how much she tried to enjoy her life, there was always this quiet shadow that followed her younger sister. Emily was charming, funny, and magnetic in ways that made people naturally gravitate toward her. Sarah loved her sister, but over the years she began to notice something uncomfortable. Emily had a way of inserting herself into situations, claiming attention, and somehow making Sarah feel like she was always on the outside. It started small, almost imperceptible. Emily would drop by unannounced, linger longer than necessary, and subtly hint at her own problems, making Sarah feel obliged to offer help. She would borrow clothes or accessories under the guise of just for a few hours and somehow never return them promptly. At first, Sarah laughed it off, thinking it was harmless. After all, sisters were supposed to lean on each other. But the more Emily came into their lives, the more Sarah noticed David's attention shifting, even in subtle ways. One evening, during a casual family dinner, Sarah finally felt the weight of what she had been ignoring. Emily arrived earlier than expected, glowing with confidence, chatting and joking, and instantly became the center of attention. David, usually attentive to Sarah, laughed a little more at Emily's stories, lingered longer in conversation, and occasionally shot glances at her that made Sarah's stomach twist. Sarah tried to ignore it, but she could feel the shift. A small, almost invisible tug at her heart grew stronger. Like a warning she had been avoiding. As the night went on, Sarah watched Emily charm everyone at the table. She recounted stories of her work and social life, casually showing off little accomplishments, and David seemed to hang on every word. Sarah's initial amusement at Emily's stories turned into unease, then jealousy. Not the loud, explosive kind, but a quiet, gnawing feeling that something in her life was slipping through her fingers. She realized, painfully, that Emily wasn't just visiting, they were slowly taking over the space Sarah had built in her own home and in David's attention. After dinner, while clearing plates, Sarah tried to talk to David casually, hoping she wasn't imagining things. "Did you notice how Emily stayed over by the living room the entire evening?" she asked, keeping her tone light. David looked at her, a little puzzled, and replied, "I just enjoy spending time with her. She's fun, and it's nice to see her." Sarah felt her heart tighten. It wasn't that David had done anything wrong, not exactly, but the way he said it, like Emily's presence had become more vibrant and exciting than her own, cut deeper than she expected. That night, Sarah lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction, every glance. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had allowed her sister to take liberties with her life, her time, and even the subtle affection she shared with her husband. It wasn't just jealousy, it was a profound awareness that she had been giving too much without asserting her own space. Emily hadn't done anything overtly malicious, but she had gradually claimed pieces of Sarah's life through charm, subtlety, and an unspoken sense of entitlement. The next day at work, Sarah found herself distracted, replaying the previous evening. She noticed little habits of Emily that she had tolerated for too long, the way she joked at her expense, the subtle insistence on attention, the way people listened to her with an almost magnetic pull. Sarah realized that her discomfort wasn't about Emily alone. It was about herself and how long she had ignored her own needs, boundaries, and sense of self by the evening. Sarah made a quiet decision. She wasn't going to confront Emily with anger or accusations that would never solve anything, but she would reclaim control over her life, her home, and her emotional space. It started with small boundaries. She would no longer allow unplanned visits to interfere with her routine. She would politely but firmly decline favors that drained her energy. Most importantly, she would nurture her connection with David, not out of competition, but to remind herself of the life they had built together. The turning point came subtly. One morning over coffee, Emily had called, casually mentioning that she wanted to stop by. Sarah, for the first time in years, said no. "I'm busy today," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Emily's pause over the phone was telling confusion, maybe even irritation. But Sarah didn't waver. She realized that for too long she had allowed others to dictate her life through guilt, charm, and obligation. That pause on the other end was the first sign that the balance was shifting. Later that evening, David noticed a change too. He commented, quietly, "You seem different lately. Stronger, more sure of yourself." Sarah smiled, a mix of relief and cautious pride swelling in her chest. This was the beginning of reclaiming her emotional space. She understood that her battle wasn't with Emily, it was with the patterns she had allowed in her own life. The recognition that she had power to set boundaries and demand respect was both frightening and exhilarating by the end of the week. Emily stopped showing up unannounced. Her calls became less frequent. And Sarah felt a sense of relief she hadn't known in years. But the emotional tension wasn't fully gone. Sarah knew this was only the beginning of asserting herself. The lingering fear that Emily would find ways to insert herself again kept her on edge. She realized she had to be consistent, intentional, and unwavering in her boundaries as part one closes. Sarah stood by the window in the quiet of her living room, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She felt a mix of determination and anxiety. The path ahead would require courage, self-respect, and emotional vigilance. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she wasn't overshadowed by her sister's charm or influence. A life where she controlled her time, her relationships, and her own happiness. And in that moment, a quiet, determined voice in her heart whispered, "It's time to take back what's mine." The next few weeks passed like a quiet storm. Sarah began noticing the difference her small choices made. She had more control over her days, more energy to focus on her home, and a renewed sense of presence in her marriage. David noticed too. He wasn't used to seeing her so calm and confident, and he admired it. But beneath the surface, there was still something unsettled to question. Neither of them dared to speak aloud. What exactly had happened between David and Emily when Sarah wasn't paying attention? Sarah didn't want to accuse anyone without reason. But her intuition whispered that there had been emotional boundaries crossed, maybe even temptations entertained. Emily's charm was disarming. She had a way of pulling people in with her laughter and warmth. Sarah remembered all those evenings when Emily and David shared jokes, exchanged knowing glances, and spoke in a rhythm that left her out of the conversation. It wasn't physical betrayal she feared most, it was emotional distance. The silent erosion of connection, determined to protect what was hers. Sarah started spending more quality time with David. She invited him on walks, cooked his favorite meals, and initiated conversations they hadn't had in years. At first, David seemed surprised by her effort, then relieved. He confessed one evening, "It feels like I have you back, Sarah." The words struck deep. She hadn't realized how far apart they'd drifted until that moment. They laughed more, shared stories, and rediscovered small rituals they had forgotten. Slow morning coffees or reading together on Sundays. But just when Sarah thought she had regained her balance, Emily reappeared. It was on a weekend afternoon when Sarah least expected it. The doorbell rang, and there she was smiling, confident, holding a bottle of wine as if nothing had changed. "I thought I'd surprise you too," she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Sarah forced a smile but felt her chest tighten. David, unaware of the tension beneath, invited her in. The air grew thick. Throughout the evening, Sarah observed every word, every glance. Emily complimented David's new haircut, laughed a little too much at his jokes, and made subtle remarks about old memories they'd shared as a family. Sarah tried to remain calm, but the familiar unease returned. Emily was testing boundaries again, inch by inch. When David left to take a call, Emily leaned toward Sarah and whispered, "You're lucky, you know. David's a good man." The tone wasn't kind, it was possessive, challenging. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark listening to David's steady breathing, her thoughts spinning. She knew Emily wasn't just seeking attention, she wanted control. Emily had always needed to feel desired, admired, and in charge. Maybe it wasn't even about David. Maybe it was about winning, proving she could have what Sarah had built. But Sarah wasn't the same woman she used to be. She had learned the cost of silence, and she was done paying it. The next morning, Sarah decided it was time for honesty. Over breakfast, she looked at David and said softly, "I need to ask you something important. Did Emily ever say or do something that made you uncomfortable?" David looked up, startled. He hesitated before replying. "She's always been a little too friendly. But I never crossed a line, Sarah, I promise you that." His tone was sincere, but his eyes showed guilt. Guilt not of wrongdoing, but of awareness. He had noticed Emily's behavior, but never stopped it. That realization hurt more than anything. Sarah didn't explode or accuse. Instead, she nodded and said, "We can't let her keep coming between us, even in small ways." David agreed immediately, almost relieved that Sarah had brought it up. Together, they decided to set boundaries as a couple. If Emily visited, it would be planned and brief. No more late-night conversations, no private jokes, no blurred lines. For a while, things improved. Sarah felt a sense of control again, and David seemed more grounded. But Emily wasn't the type to give up easily. When her calls and visits didn't get the same attention, she started leaving subtle remarks in family group chats or sending nostalgic messages directly to David. "Remember that weekend at the cabin? We had such a good time." It's just harmless words on a screen, but the intent was clear. Sarah found out accidentally one evening when David left his phone on the counter. She saw the message and froze. It wasn't scandalous, but it was enough to reopen every wound she'd tried to heal. She didn't confront him right away. Instead, she sat outside in the cold night air, her heart heavy but clear. She knew she couldn't control Emily's actions, but she could control her response. And this time, silence wouldn't protect her. Later that night, Sarah calmly showed David the message. "This needs to stop," she said. Her tone wasn't angry. It was tired. David looked ashamed. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have blocked her the moment she crossed the line." That was the first time Sarah saw him take full responsibility, and strangely, it gave her peace. David blocked Emily's number that night. It felt final, but Sarah knew the emotional recovery would take time. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Yet something within Sarah had changed. She had always been the peacekeeper, the one who avoided confrontation to maintain harmony. But this experience taught her the value of standing firm. She began focusing on her personal growth, taking painting classes, meeting new friends, and spending time alone without guilt. She rediscovered parts of herself she had neglected for years. David noticed her transformation. One evening he told her, "You're stronger than I ever realized." "I think that's what I fell in love with in the first place." Sarah smiled, touched by the sincerity in his words. The trust between them wasn't fully repaired yet. But there was honesty, now a shared understanding. That love wasn't about pretending everything was fine, but facing the cracks together. But Emily's silence didn't last. A month later, Sarah received a message from her, short, sharp, and emotional. "I miss you, Sarah. Why did you turn everyone against me?" Sarah read it twice, unsure how to respond. Part of her pitied Emily. Another part was too tired to play that emotional game again. She didn't reply. She realized that sometimes peace doesn't come from fixing. Relationships comes from releasing them. In the quiet days that followed, Sarah reflected on everything she had learned. She wasn't the same woman who once doubted herself, who stood in her own home feeling invisible. She had taken back her power, not by revenge or anger, but by clarity and courage. She had drawn her lines and stood by them, and in doing so, she had saved more than her marriage, she had saved herself. One evening, as she and David sat on the porch watching the sunset, he reached for her hand and said, "We went through a storm, didn't we?" Sarah smiled faintly. "Yes, but we're still here." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was real. And for Sarah, real was enough yet. Deep down, she knew the story wasn't completely over. Family ties had a way of resurfacing, especially when pride and old wounds were involved. She didn't know when or how, but Emily would appear again someday. Only this time, Sarah would be ready. The quiet fear that once controlled her had been replaced with strength. And as the sun disappeared behind the hills, she whispered to herself, "No one will take what's mine again." Sarah woke early the morning after receiving Emily's message. A quiet light filtered through the curtains, and the house felt still, holding its breath. She sat at the kitchen table, coffee untouched, reading and rereading the words. "I miss you, Sarah. Why did you turn everyone against me?" Her fingers curled around the cup. She didn't feel anger. She felt something gentler: relief, sadness, clarity. She realized she was no longer waiting for Emily's approval. She was waiting for her own peace. David considered calling out to her, but changed his mind when he heard her door open and close softly. He entered the kitchen, paused, and asked, "Everything okay?" Sarah nodded, slowly raising her grip on the mug. "I'm fine. I'm ready." David studied her face. It held something new, a calm resolve. He reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder. "Together," he said. "We're together." Over the next week, Sarah and David made a pact between them. No more letting silent tensions steer their marriage. They agreed to talk openly, to share small moments again, and to rebuild trust by actions, not promises. David surprised her by picking up Lily from school. And Sarah surprised herself by saying yes to an art class she had considered but postponed. The house felt fuller not with other people, but with the life they chose together. One afternoon, while Sarah painted in the spare room, she found herself smiling as colors spread across the canvas. The brush strokes weren't perfect. They didn't need to be. This was about expression, not perfection. When David knocked and entered with 2 glasses of lemonade, he watched her quietly for a moment. "You look happier," he said. She didn't hide it. Instead, she admitted it. "I feel lighter." The change wasn't loud, it was gentle, persistent. But even these gentle changes had ripples. Emily's message wasn't a fault line. It was a reminder. Sarah knew Emily would test boundaries again. She received a call from her sister a few days later. "Can we talk?" Emily's tone sounded soft, vulnerable. Sarah looked at David before replying. He nodded. They chose to handle it as a team. They arranged a meeting in a neutral Plaza cafe both knew. Emily arrived, smiled, and greeted them. Sarah noticed how Emily's expression flickered when she found Sarah and David sitting side by side, equal and unshaken. Coffee arrived. The 3 of them sat quietly at first. Emily spoke first. "I've felt lost lately. I thought you were on my side, Sarah, but I feel you turned away." Sarah took a breath. She looked at her sister with honest eyes. "Emily, I never stopped being your sister. But I stopped letting you take my life, copycat style. I stopped letting you stand in my place." Emily's brow furrowed. David reached for Sarah's hand lightly. Sarah continued, "I love you, but I also love the life I built. You and I can coexist, just not at the cost of me disappearing." Emily sat back, silent. The hush stretched between them. Then she spoke in a small voice. "I didn't mean for it to feel like that." Sarah nodded. "Then let's change it. From now on, we're sisters, not rivals." The cafe's ambient hum returned. David exhaled. The moment shifted subtly. It wasn't resolved completely, but the direction changed. When they left the cafe, Sarah felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. The drive home was quiet, comfortable. David took her hand as they stopped at a red light. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. Sarah rested her head against his shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for staying." In the weeks that followed, Sarah stopped looking at her marriage as something fragile. It wasn't perfect, but it was present. She started inviting laughter into their home again. They had movie nights, board games with Lily, spontaneous walks around their neighborhood. They didn't pretend past hurts didn't exist. They acknowledged them and left them on the side of the road, like old baggage. One evening, Sarah found her journal tucked away in the drawer. She flipped to the entry she once feared would destroy everything. "I feel like a stranger in my own life." She stared at it and realized how far she had come. She closed it, walked outside, and let it sit unopened. She didn't need to revisit that chapter. It had served its purpose. Months later, the day arrived when Sarah held an artwork of hers in a small exhibit. David and Lily stood beside her as people admired the piece of colorful canvas capturing the strength of a woman who chose herself. Emily appeared to, quietly observing from the background. Sarah caught her gaze, nodded thoughtfully, and Emily nodded back. No words were exchanged, but there was something quieter than an apology or respect that night. After Lily had gone to bed, Sarah and David sat on the porch. The night air, warm and gentle. Sarah leaned into David. He wrapped his arms around her, and she felt safe. "We made it through something hard," she said, "and we found something real." David kissed her forehead. "We did. And we're building something new." As the stars blinked overhead, Sarah thought back to the moment when she made that decision, when she stood at the edge of losing everything and chose to fight for herself. She realized the story wasn't a dramatic twist or scandal. It was about reclaiming her voice, her worth, and her life. Her sister would always be part of her story, but no longer the chapter that defined her. And in the quiet closing of that chapter, Sarah finally felt freedom. Freedom from shadows of doubt, from the fear of being invisible, from waiting for others to give her permission to shine. Elliot and Lily and their home, her home, became the proof that boundaries don't weaken love, they refine it. As the night deepened, Sarah closed her eyes and whispered, "I won't settle for less than I deserve." And in that promise, the past dissolved and a new future began.